events of the day, but we'll get right on with the events. The song is What I Did for Love. There are all kinds of love, as you know. There's the sexual love, the love of parents, the love of children, the love of country, love of friends. A person that I admired very much, that I considered a giant among human beings, passed away this week. And I truly loved him, not in the physical sense, in the general, broad, total sense as a person, and that was Henry Miller. He died last Sunday, 8th of June. He was the man who freed me through what he said and the way he lived and what he wrote. In all ways, he freed me from my hang-ups, my cocoon, from Beverly Hills and Stanford, and I was able to branch out and become the kind of person I wanted to become. He was the one who wrote and lived the life of going out, taking the risks, taking the chances. It's your life. You can make changes. You can't look back later and say, I only wanted to do this because it was expedient at the time. Do what is right at the time and no apologies later, and take your chances. As I say, take your risks. And when I left Los Angeles and moved up here, Henry had left the Big Sur area and had moved in with his children. They were in junior high, going to high school. He wanted to be with them down there. He left Big Sur, and I made that giant step from that area up to here in Carmel and asked him, should I continue the research? I had the Warren Commission testimony, the exhibits and documents, and the Warren report, and they were already published, and it was perfectly obvious from page 1 that a conspiracy did exist, and I didn't know whether to pursue it or forget the whole thing and go into another life up here. And it was Henry who encouraged me that if I believed that there was something important, to stay with it. And it was something that you don't back away from if there's a calling or a need. It was critical of his later years because he took no political position. He left France when the Nazis came in and went to Greece and came back to the United States. He was great at allowing individual freedoms, freedom of expression, of lifestyle, of getting rid of the bondage of what the multinationals tell you need to own. He had very few material possessions. He reminded me of Gandhi in that sense. He had a bicycle he liked that he kept in the living room, and if you admired a picture of a well-known artist, he'd take it off the wall and want to give it to you. He was generous to a T, and he gave me some books. They're autographed copies, some first editions in my library, and each of my children, now adults, have a watercolor of Henry's. I have one. Our house was filled with his pictures. I didn't know him well. There was that transition when I moved up here and got involved in the research. I didn't believe that it was compatible to have individual liberty and not social political liberty, that no matter how free you are from the hang-ups and the slavery of the system in conforming to everything they tell you need or should be doing, in addition to having that individual freedom, if society out there becomes fascist, as it did in Nazi Germany or Italy or all over Europe, and later engulfed the world, if you get a fascism, you don't have individual freedom in the fascism. So I believe very strongly that you have to fight them at both levels. But Henry chose to be a recluse, to write, to see people, and continue to liberate them individually. So we did have that difference, and I went my own way. But I have a library of everything he's ever written and did collect the first editions, and there's over 60 books. Many of them are known as from the famous tropics, the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. I've given you a list of a few books of Henry's, and you can get bibliographies of his books as Henry Miller Societies and records where he has interviews that are very valuable. I've had a few heroes. One was Virginia Woolf. I began reading her as soon as I went into Stanford. She taught me the importance of family and the importance of never putting off tomorrow what you can do today. And also, don't break promises to children because they always remember. Sartre passed this year, and I did a tape about him. These people were not the New York, Paris, London liberal chic. These people are the activists who lived the way they wrote and felt, and these were my heroes. Virginia Woolf, as I say, was one of them. Sartre was one. Samuel Beckett is a giant. He's still alive. His plays Endgame and Waiting for Godot are masterpieces of literature. going into the master-slave relationship, how hard it is to free slaves. The bulk of the population in the world are slaves, but they enjoy the relationship, otherwise they would break it. When the master drops the whip, the slave hands it back to him and asks for more. The free people, the resistance fighters, those who don't like being slaves, are in the minority. That is the group that I associate with and I'm proud to know, and people who try to change the system rather than say thank you when they get a kick in the behind. Well, Henry has passed. People like this don't leave you. They make their influence, and hopefully you pass it on to other people. Henry was a great man. Air-conditioned nightmares about going up to Michigan, traveling across the United States when he returned from Europe, seeing automobiles and explaining how Americans sold their pocketbook, their entire paychecks or earnings to have that vehicle to take them around, people around the world who went on foot and bicycle. Envied Americans, the automobile, but the automobile and the machinery swallowed us up. Air-conditioned nightmare, the cosmological eye stands still like a hummingbird. I have a whole list for you put on the printed sheet, and hopefully maybe you can read some of these books because they really are fantastic. Mort Saul says that the wars are numbered, World War I and II, because there would be a long series of them, and that's why they start out giving them a number. Very often when I make a tape on an important subject, I begin to number 1 and 2 because I know that there'll be follow-ups. I asked a while back in the first of the year about William Taub, the gentleman who wrote the book Forces of Evil. Who was William Taub? That was January 25th, 1980, almost a half a year ago. This seemed like a interesting person who had been left for dead at the height of the Watergate exposés, who was close to Richard Nixon and the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa and Howard used the Aristotle Onassis links. And all of a sudden Taub surfaced with a book called Forces of Power, an interesting book. And I began to ask the question, who is William Taub? He's one of those important connecting links like Irv Davidson, who's going to be involved with the AB scam in Davidson very shortly, that I did tapes about. In addition to doing 2 or 3, 4 tapes on Taub, and many of you can get the book, I have the publisher and the address so you can get the information. I also did a tape on who is Catherine Reyland. That's a woman who we discovered through listeners of the tapes was credited with having written the book of William Taub, and I mentioned that at a party in New York City of a few close friends. We met one Saturday in August this last summer. Bob Fass, formerly on WBAI radio, brought Catherine Reyland to the gathering, and Catherine was the woman that assisted William Taub with writing his book, and he credits her in the back of the book for giving that help. Miss Catherine Reyland got really angry at Mae Brussell, the audacity of asking my listeners, she calls them my followers, who is Catherine Reyland? She said I could have called her on the telephone and asked her who she was or what I wanted to know, but that's not my business. I want to make one point perfectly clear. If you are a friend of mine and you are invited to my home, or if you are a friend of mine and I am invited to your home, I do not make tapes or expose you or write about you publicly. But if you come to a social gathering and are invited and bring 3 people who are uninvited, and one of them takes an index card with the names of everybody at the party, another takes photographs, and if that third person, uninvited, worked with William Taub, who is in the inner circles of organized crime, the Vatican, the Teamsters, the mob, Richard Nixon, and the whole sleazy crowd, if 3 people crash a gathering of personal friends where I have invited my own friends, Bob Fass was invited. He brought 3 people to the gathering who were uninvited, and it kicked up a storm that I want to describe to you, because sometimes the headlines in the news that you're getting every day in the newspaper are not as important as seeing how the division works among the so-called left, or people that should have a lot in common, the divide and conquer, and how these people infiltrate your own private social gathering by appearing, as I say, taking your names, taking your pictures, and then have the audacity to be arrogant about it. I got a letter from Catherine, and she asked, why didn't I call and ask who she is? I take the lesson of John Mitchell. He said, don't listen to what I say, watch what I do. If she assisted Taub with his book and didn't offer any information about him to us or everyone there who would be very interested in some of this information, I want to know who she is. Now, she wrote me a letter using some interesting language. She referred to the people at the gathering as having, in quotes, a yen for the conspiratorial. This is the nerve of a woman who worked with William Taub. She described us as conspiracy theorists. That adjective theorist is always a giveaway. A conspiracy is a meeting of two or more people doing an illegal act. And if she worked for the Kaplan Fund, and I'm going into that, the trustee, one of the trustees for the CIA Kaplan Foundation, and worked for William Taub, that she must have worked very much with actual conspiracy involvement persons. And she refers to us as a theorist, as if conspiracies don't exist, and wrote to me about her activities with the Kaplan Fund. She said, in quotes, I took a part-time job as secretary to Richard D. Kaplan, an architect. I paid his bills, kept his business in order, and of course Mr. Kaplan is a member of the Kaplan family and a trustee of the Kaplan Fund, the notorious alleged conduit of CIA funds. Perhaps something sinister could be made of that connection. Aside from working for Mr. Kaplan, my life is a dreadful disappointment to anyone with a yen for the conspiratorial. I really doubt, aside from working with Mr. Kaplan, that her life with William Taub wouldn't be interesting to anybody with a yen for the conspiratorial. Her words amongst and yen, and her adjectives are very standard, and they reveal a lot about Ms. Reyland also. Now, she worked for Mr. Kaplan and a member of the Kaplan Fund, and thinks that maybe it's an alleged conduit. All she has to do is to look into the congressional records in 1946, the admission of the Kaplans in 1967, the congressional hearings that the Kaplans admitted that they were very much a part of the Central Intelligence Agency. There's no alleged about it. This has been documented in many, many documents, not by people spreading dirty rumors, but they said that, yes, they did fund much money to the Central Intelligence Agency. And the interesting part is that their money went into the educational and the labor fronts. Educational could be public broadcasting and television that they were in the educational, educating people in Central and South America, Central America, and in the United States, and they were a direct conduit of the Central Intelligence Agency. She said that Bob Markle, editor-in-chief of Grosset and Dunlap, turned her to the Taub job. She was sent by the editor-in-chief of Grosset and Dunlap to work for William Taub, who had all of these connections, as I say, to the family of Trujillo, who had been murdered in the Dominican Republic. He was the attorney for one daughter and received $1 million, or was the representative, not the attorney. Taub didn't ever say if he had a law degree. He represented one of the daughters of Trujillo, and Richard Nixon represented the other one. Each one got $1 million. In his book, Forces of Power, Taub writes, or Kathleen wrote for him, she did the rewriting of the book, the joint venture of Richard Nixon concerned the pursuit of a huge fortune purloined by the brothers of our respective clients, Flora and Angelita Trujillo. Angelita hired the firm of Mudge Rose, that's where Richard Nixon was, and I was representing my good friend Flora Trujillo. Their father, the Generalissimo of the Dominican Republic, had been assassinated. On a spring night in 1961, two men working out of Miami made a trip to the Dominican Republic in a disguised plane. This was a CIA operation, later acknowledged as CIA. They brought guns, ammunition, and a plan for the assassination of Trujillo. Their plan succeeded, and after the assassination, his two sons fled the country with the remainder of the fortune, a good part removed to France, Spain, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. While he was head of the Dominican Republic, he controlled 48 companies, an auto distributorship, paint factory, match factory, sugar mill, owned 60% of the land, took between $150 million and $1 billion, a broad range. And then William Taub, who Ms. Reyland is writing the book for, represented one of the members of the family, and Richard Nixon represented the other. After Trujillo was murdered and all this money was floating around Europe, The Kaplan Fund then went into the Dominican Republic and opened up offices, and they worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and continued to disseminate the CIA information after they successfully got Trujillo murdered and his family's money was in the hands of these kinds of people. Well, she was sent by the editor-in-chief of Grosset and Dunlap to go to Taub's job, which is no simple job considering the kind of money floating around and the connections they had. And this is the way Catherine describes Taub, the man that she worked for. He acknowledged her in the book as helping write the book. She says Taub was, in quotes, a fixer. In quotes, he knew every unsavory character, famous or infamous. She worked for him 3 months. I found him nothing short of odious. His politics were despicable. His friends and associates were my sworn enemy. Now, I really don't know how hard it is to make a buck out there, that somebody has to work for someone so repugnant. Under the control of who? Did Grosset and Dunlap order her to take that job, or why didn't she leave? She had the option to leave, and she writes that this is a horrible person. She goes on to describe the fact that Taub was arrested for embezzlement, that he's a slumlord in Harlem, that he owned property along with Mr. Sutton. One Sutton, the Judge Sutton, locked up and handcuffed her boyfriend, the one that brought her to the party, Bob Fass, and the other Sutton, who is a powerful man with New York radio, had her station's manager, WBAI, and the station they were fighting to control and keep on the air. He hired all those main people that put Bob Fass off the air into his network of communications. I did a little bit on that, and I'll do more later. She describes him as a despicable person, and then she goes on to say he's in trouble, and I hope that by this time that he's in jail. She heard he was in jail, and I hope that he's in jail. Then this Catherine Reyland continues her letter, and she says, I'm nothing short of outraged to have my good name in such bad company. It's ironic that she writes that at a time that I'm talking about Henry Miller on the tape, because that's the kind of thing that Henry taught me and teaches other people. If you don't like it, leave it. Walk out. Don't work for somebody and take their money and then describe them as filthy and criminals, and you hope they're in jail. There is no obligation. There is no requirement to be corrupt or to be with people that are so devious or corrupt or odious or despicable, whose friends are your enemies. She always had the choice to leave, and besides that, she accused me of linking her to these terrible people. I didn't link her. In the credits, Taub acknowledges the fact that she helped write the book and that Percy Sutton is his friend. So she writes to me, how dare you link me with these people, when she's working with them all the time, to have my name in such bad company. Well, she better get her name off those acknowledgments, and she better get her name out of that company. If it's so bad, get out or else shut up, because I have no patience for these kind of people who act offended when you link them to somebody. When she got paid to do the job and took the acknowledgments, she linked herself, and that's an important point to make. I didn't link her to anything. I'm sharing it with you people, but I didn't make the connections. The day that she walked in and started taking her paycheck, you go to bed with dogs, you get up with fleas, and I hope she's scratching a lot. She writes to me that among the acknowledgments in the book is this Percy Sutton, and as I say, he was the one who he and his brother harmed the very man who is living with her at this time, and the one that introduced her into the society of my friends. I wish he had never been there. The acknowledgments of the book mention members of the Saudi Arabian royal family, and is giving credit or friends of Mr. Taub. He has a list of people, and Percy Sutton and Catherine Reyland are among those acknowledged as helping be good friends or helping write the book. And Taub's blurb on the cover describes him as a man who's been from the social circles of Hollywood, Las Vegas, the White House, the Vatican, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Hoffa, Howard Hughes, and Aristotle Onassis. That's some of the company that Taub keeps. And she sent from Grosset and Dunlap over to work on that manuscript. New York Times, February 22nd, 1967, ran an article on the Kaplan Foundation and the fund, Incidentally, for you researchers who are fairly new at this or old ones who don't have this information, go to your library and look up the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, and Time magazine, February 1967, and photocopy the many articles. I have a whole notebook of articles that came out on the CIA interlocking links. And they broke at that time. There's the Anderson Foundation that Leon Jaworski in Houston was on the board of directors of, and Leon Jaworski was on the Warren Commission. There's the Republic National Bank, articles about that, and its conduit of black money, which is murder money. And that's where Connie Trammell worked, who was at the office of the Hunt brothers that Jack Ruby took her to the Wednesday before John Kennedy was assassinated. This series that came out in February 1967 goes into using the American Express for conduit of funds, Radio Free Europe, and the International Federation of Journalists with their headquarters in Belgium and how they were funded, and the Andrew Hamilton Fund of Philadelphia, the CIA funds out of Columbus, Ohio, other CIA funds into Uruguay. There's a whole series of articles of foundations and Cuban Freedom Commission of the Christian Forum, the Greek Orthodox Church. These all came out in February 1967, and there's the links of the CIA, as I say, to Leon Jaworski, and members of the Warren Commission are there. Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who administered the oath of office to President Johnson, was part of the Republic National Bank, conduit of CIA funds. Copy these, as I say, I have 40 or 50 excellent articles going into the Kaplan Fund as a conduit of CIA money and where some of that money went from the Kaplan Fund. One article from the New York Times, March the 5th, 1967, said that the Kaplan Fund in 1962 delivered to the Labor Institute $220,000. It received from the CIA funds, the Price Fund, the Edsel Fund, the Beacon Fund, the Kenfield Fund. The Labor Institute received money from the Kaplan Fund that went into these various front organizations. This is just around the time of the Kennedy assassination, 1962 and 63. And Wright Patman in Congress in 1964 said that Mr. Rogovin, that name comes up now with Abscam and the casinos in New Jersey and the Central Intelligence Agency. Patman said that Mr. Rogovin, the tax service liaison man, informed us that the J.M. Kaplan Fund has been a conduit operating and channeling CIA funds and operations for many years. And it goes into the Attorney General and Mr. Patman and Mr. Rogovin and questions that were asked about the CIA fund of the Kaplan, specifically the Kaplan. But these articles break down many of the foundations and funds that were interlocking. For 2 years, there was an investigation in the Justice Department of a charitable organization known as the Kaplan Fund in New York City, but the investigation was cut off by the Internal Revenue. They were mixing their charity and their funding and their business when they became a conduit for money of the CIA. They called in congressional hearings with Mitchell Rogovin, Internal Revenue's liaison with the CIA, and they explained to Wright Patman and others that it becomes national security, of course, and the money that's funneled is into the intelligence community, so they had to stop investigating the business shenanigans of the Kaplan Fund. There's another interesting article, February 22nd, 1967, in the New York Times. Norman Thomas, the former Socialist Party leader, defended a program under which Latin American politicians of the Democratic left were trained largely at the expense of the Central Intelligence Agency. Norman Thomas was chairman of the Institute of International Labor Research. They ran schools in Costa Rica and then the Dominican Republic. And keep in mind Richard Nixon and William Taub's links to the Dominican Republic. And they had a publishing house in Mexico between 1957 and 1965. William Buckley was an agent of the CIA with E. Howard Hunt in Mexico. Lee Harvey Oswald was in Mexico in 1963 in the fall, before he was the fall guy for the Kennedy assassination. The Bay of Pigs operatives went, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, to Mexico, where they retrenched and were armed and trained with assassination teams in Oaxaca, Mexico. The Kaplan Fund was identified as part of the CIA as early as 1964, right after the Kennedy assassination. And they also worked with Mr. Thomas on Radio Free Europe, brainchild of a Mr. Volman from Romania, who came to the United States also doing radio communications. This one article tells about the Kaplan Fund and their grants, $1 million just to the labor group, that they acknowledge $1 million fund to the particular Labor Institute of the left, a group that got $1 million just there. And then Mr. Kaplan granted more CIA money and opened a school in Costa Rica that ran a 10-week session training 50 to 60 Latin American politicians. And then they were advisors to senators and representatives and educators and so forth. Then they were teaching, according to the New York Times article, the CIA was training people to teach how to run a country. The faculty included Juan Bosch, who replaced Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and then he was kicked out. And they had the former president of Costa Rica. The school was in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. The Kaplan Fund, which was linked not only to Santo Domingo and the Dominican Republic, but Catherine Reyland worked for a trustee of the Kaplan Fund, and Mr. Taub was very much involved in the politics or finances of the Dominican Republic. They also funded the Institute of International Labor Research and an educational group. There were several groups that they funded, and they had other enterprises. They were connected to the Parvin Foundation of Santa Barbara and the National Association of Broadcasters to produce films and to teach literacy. Now you have the Kaplan Fund in broadcasting and persons working with William Taub, such as Percy Sutton, taking over broadcasting of Third World and radio stations all over the world, and predominantly in New York City. You have broadcasting, the Parvin Foundation, and then you take one giant step, and this article goes on, and you can get more material on Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. He was a board member of the Parvin Fund, which was funded by the Kaplan Fund, and there were the interlocking, connecting links of the Parvin Foundation, Dorman Foundation to organized crime, to Las Vegas, the Mafia, and the Kaplan Fund. So this is the same interlocking group that William Taub writes about, the Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters, the mobsters, the CIA, and the labor groups. And this woman goes from working for the Kaplan Fund to working on a book of William Taub's, and then dating and moving in, or Bob moving in with her, a broadcaster who was kicked off New York radio because he was telling the truth about the assassinations of what was going on with organized crime, the CIA, and the mobsters and the Nazi connections. That's why Bob was taken off the air. So this one article in the New York Times goes into the Parvin Foundation and William Douglas, and it also links these organizations to the Kaplan Fund and the Central Intelligence Agency. It's very important to share this with you because it's one microcosm of what you have when you're a researcher and you go on a vacation and you want to meet with a handful of friends and you invite somebody, and I invited Bob Fass because he opened up the airwaves. He made it possible for me to meet all of you people on the East Coast and even more than that, and arrange lectures at the Elgin Theater. And we were on all night from California and in New York talking about these conspiracies, and they yanked Bob off the air just as they yanked Paul Krasner out of journalism. He published my 3 articles, and Bob made it possible for me to meet a much larger audience so that the conduit was broken. Those people were completely destroyed as individuals to get free news out on the air. And these are the kind of organizations that are behind the scenes. It takes years to put the pieces and the threads together, but they all fall into place, whether it's the broadcasters, the Kaplan, Percy Sutton, New York radio, free radio, etc., the labor movement, and so forth. The so-called left is controlled by the intelligence community, and free speech, public listening, sponsored radio will not allow free speech. And if they go too far, they're yanked off, and new people get on the station and moderate to make sure that this kind of information cannot get on those radio stations. Out of the tape, I'll do just a little bit more about this episode because I'm sure we haven't heard the end of it. On the 13th, 1980, Friday 13th again, side 2 of the tape. You notice how angry I get when these pinheads like Catherine Reyland ask, "Why didn't you call and ask me who I was?" Such an insult to intelligence, you can see how people operate, who they work for, and how they manipulate and divide, and the words they use, the adjectives, the description, and the secrecy with which they never divulge information, but they get offended if you suggest anything, in quotes, conspiratorial. Well, the hell with that, You don't have a bleeper on these radio stations, or I would say more. I forget that sometimes the tapes are not just private between you and me, but they are played on the air. If you want more about the Parvin Foundation and about the left and the labor movement and the group of people around Bob Fass, such as Abby Hoffman and those characters, write to Sherman Skolnick in Chicago. I have the address on the printed sheets with the tape. If you don't get those, it's 9800 South Oglesby Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, 60617. And if that is too fast, you'll have to write and get the address from me. I won't repeat it again. Send a contribution because the postage and the printing keep going up. And he'll send you copies of information that he has on various conspiracies and conspirators. But he has a very fine sheet on the Chicago 7, Behind the Mask, Who? And he asks questions about these various people, about the Kaplan Fund. He talks about Roger Baldwin Foundation, interlocked with the Chicago offices of the American Civil Liberties Union. The head of the Civil Liberties Union in Chicago for years moved out to Carmel area, Mr. Crowley, and he takes over here in this area. If you talk about assassinations or murders, he just simply laughs it off. That group worked with the Roger Baldwin Foundation that was funded through CIA money from J.M. Kaplan Fund, identified in New York Times Index under U.S. Intelligence Agency in 1967, and they go into the links of the Albert Parvin Foundation, that's in California and Chicago, and of course that group is linked, as I said, Justice Douglas and organized crime. You can send for a sheet from Sherman Skolnick and break that down and outline it, and then have an overlay of some of these cast of characters of the left, of the news media, radio, and so forth, and labor with the intelligence community of the Kaplan Fund. Jack Anderson has an article this last week, a CIA agent by the name of Ralph McGee. He spent 25 years with the CIA, and he charges that the top people in the agency lie. They cover up their operations to the public. They lie to Congress, and they lie to the president. And he said every word in a public announcement by a CIA official should be examined, that they purposely carry on illegal activities, and that you can't get the truth from them, even from to the President of the United States. So if people like John Stanley and Catherine Reyland want to know why I don't call them, they're not under oath. They're not under obligation to tell me who they are. We saw Richard Nixon at the time of Watergate take an oath of office as president to uphold the laws and the truth and tell you on the wide screen that he didn't know who the people were that were arrested at the hotel. If the president can get on national television and lie, why would I have to call the parties involved and ask them about their past? Go to your library and get Newsweek, March 6, 1967. And on the back of that article is a picture of Jim Garrison and an article on the Kennedy assassination you might have missed, the death of David Ferry in New Orleans and the assassination conspiracy in New Orleans. That was just the time when Clay Shaw was arrested and David Ferry was dead. It has a chart of the various CIA foundations, and it includes the J.M. Kaplan Fund from New York. They gave money to the Institute of International Labor Research and the Institute of International Education. So when you have labor and you have education, you have pretty good handle on the media, communications, and as I say, they were into radio work and the Dominican and all over the world. The CIA fronts that passed to the Kaplan Foundation, and there's a diagram. It shows the Gotham Foundation, the Borden Trust, the Beacon Fund, the Price Fund, the Edsel Fund, the Kentfield Fund, Michigan Fund, and the Andrew Hamilton Fund out of Philadelphia. All that CIA money, those were fronts, went to the Kaplan Fund in New York, and then it in turn went out to the labor groups and also to the international education, which included United States and overseas education. just the title education doesn't really explicitly tell you until you break down how they set up their schools in Costa Rica or Dominican Republic or through the news media or newscasting or Radio Free Europe. Just education, but it doesn't even give half the sinister tentacles of what education means when the CIA goes about doing it. Wouldn't it be nice if our tax dollars went directly to your community and your schools and your citizens for privileged children, underprivileged children, high IQs, low IQs, enrichment programs, skills, arts, talents? Imagine the CIA bankrolling all this money through all these various foundations and all the secrecy and the shredding of papers. And where does the CIA get their money? If you read this Newsweek, it's a very good diagram, as I say, March 67, and you see all the conduits of money going into the Anderson Foundation, the Hoblisville, the Baird, the Winfield Foundation, Frederick Brown Foundation, the RAB, the Marshall Foundation, all of this sinister money going where they could improve schools, improve the quality of our thinking and minds, and not do this devious brainwashing. The recipients were the American Council of Jurists, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Institute for Labor Research, the Synods of Bishops of the Russian Church outside of Russia. That's the Greek Orthodox Church, to the Tolstoy Foundation that brought in the Sirhan family from Palestine to Pasadena, and Marina Oswald and white Russians into the United States, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That's about 28 or 30 of them that were associates of Lee and Marina Oswald. CIA money to the American Friends of the Middle East, anti-Israeli propaganda and funding and manipulation of markets, Institute of International Education, Public Administration, Research in North Africa, National Student Association, Operation and Policy Research. So our tax dollars go into all of these various conduits and then sent out to recipients to figure out ways to keep profits in the hands of the multinational and make sure that the poor remain as slaves or in concentration camps similar to the Indian reservations in the United States, or torture instruments and police squads trained at low wages, early deaths, cradle to grave, oppression, repressions, manipulated news media, and all this money was going to either the center or the left, or the far left, and they don't need to send it to the right, they already have them. But the subversion and the complication the networks, keep in mind, always go to anybody who wants to effect social change, to subvert them, discredit them, divide them. That's what the money is used for, and Kaplan was one of those groups. On tape 439, May the 2nd, I did some background about Percy Sutton and his international radio connections, his $23 million communication empire, his corporations in oil and coal, his work with the federal government. This is Percy Sutton, who was acknowledged in the book as being a pal of William Taub, and at the same time that he was his buddy and slumlord owner, this Catherine Reyland was working for Taub and writing a book about his great and interesting life. Sutton built his empire on radio stations going all over the world, 18 in Italy, in Africa, inner city broadcasting, and of course his New York radio stations took on and gave much bigger salaries all the people that allowed Bob Fass and Mae Brussell to be kicked off the air. They were rewarded with bigger and better jobs for Percy Sutton at his 7 radio stations in New York City. Another article in the New York Times, February 18, 1967. 5 more academic and international organizations are receiving funds from the CIA. It goes into the Pan American Foundation in the University of Miami, the International Marketing Institute, a private organization at Harvard Business, the American Society of African Culture in New York City, and American Friends in the Middle East. And it states the American Friends of the Middle East is an organization mentioned in congressional hearings in 1964, receiving funds from the CIA-connected J.M. Kaplan Fund of New York. The American Friends of the Middle East sponsors travel to the Middle East and finances publications. They usually take a pro-Arab stand, and its public policy and pronouncements are pro-Arab. It comes a great deal from the Kaplan Fund. The name of American Friends of the Middle East was in the news this week. If you watched NBC, the nightly news, June the 10th, or read an article, it was in the Los Angeles Times, a former employee of the Hunt brothers, of Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt. This employee, William Bledsoe, is a former vice president of the Hunt Energy Corporation, is accusing the Hunts of working to corner, squeeze, and manipulate the silver prices around the world, that they were driving up the price of silver. And this employee claims that there was perjury at the trial of the Hunts, that they worked with the Shah of Iran when he was in power and with the officials in Saudi Arabia in buying up the world silver market. But the conduit for all that was John Connally through the Friends of the Middle East. That's the former governor of Texas, who I mentioned last week on the tapes, is working with the Hunt brothers and various officials to turn the entire world Christian. The American Friends of the Middle East was anti-Jewish, and Connally was the conduit not only of being against Israel, but manipulating the financial empire of silver and coins. There's another article in the Salinas paper a few weeks ago that I don't want to digress too far from, but it has to do with the Hunts taking care of the silver market and then issuing their own money. In other words, when our market collapses, they're ready to come out and print their own money or certificates. There were many articles, as I say, in 1967 about the expose of the CIA and these foundations, and you should get your Newsweek in time and read about the money that went, in quotes, to students, teachers, scholars, churchmen, jurists, and union organizers. Of course, the Torbett document that exposes the cabal around the Kennedy assassination maintains that the top lawyers working for the left were always part of the intelligence community. I believe that Ramsey Clark and Leonard Weinglass and Mark Lane and all these name showpiece lawyers, Melvin Belli and F. Lee Bailey, are all linked to the intelligence community, and they step in on these so-called liberal or radical causes. Mr. Kunstler is another one. I believe that all of them can be shown to have interlocking links to some of the subversion of the really liberal policies that never got off the ground in this country. There was a breath or hope at the end of the Eisenhower-Nixon era that things would turn around here, but that was ended in 1,000 days when John Connally, as the governor of Texas, took over and concealed the assassination, and Lyndon Johnson from Texas went on to become president of the United States. I received a letter last week from one of the subscribers who mentioned that the Kaplan Fund funded Freedom House, of which Brzezinski is chairman, and Mr. Lowenstein was a member, and they also funded Leo Chern's International Rescue Committee. Now, I've done other tapes on Leo Chern. He was the man who sent Spaz Rakin to New York Harbor to meet Lee and Marina Oswald when they returned from Russia in June of 1962. Marina is a Tsarist white Russian who came to this country to set the stage to make Lee Harvey Oswald the patsy. He was a decoy turned into a patsy, and he had worked with Powers, helped down the U-2 flight from the Minsk radio factory. I believe that Lee and Marina's links to Leo Chern should be exposed. They haven't so far. Leo Chern also worked with the SLA. He had a book of agents, names of agents of the SLA who were members of the CIA. The book was missing in Paris when he came back to the United States, that little green book, and it was picked up in Southeast Asia and brought back. And at the time it was brought back, Judge Carter, who had Patty Hearst's case, died quickly on the bench, and the Leo Chern story that broke just briefly was suppressed. Leo Chern was appointed by Gerald Ford on the Rockefeller Committee to look into intelligence activity along with Ronald Reagan, and various members of the intelligence community were on that panel and covered up again the assassination of John Kennedy and other misdeeds. It was a little blue ribbon commission after Watergate that would keep people satisfied that they were looking into something. Well, Brzezinski and Lowenstein and Chern linked to the Kaplan Fund. I may have more on that for you later. There's so many places to look up on the Kaplan Fund. And talking about the assassination of John Kennedy, I mentioned a few weeks ago a book coming out by Anthony Summers called Conspiracy. A lot of people don't trust Anthony Summers. Penn Jones doesn't. Various researchers don't. I thought it was interesting that he was writing a book on the Kennedy assassination. He wrote one on the file on the Tsar, and people who are experts on the escape of the Romanovs claim that there's disinformation in the book, but the book still suggests, through documents that they received, that the Tsar's family did leave Russia at the time of the revolution. And it seems pretty well documented that the exchange, or line and to live, was made for Lenin coming from Switzerland back to Russia. At the time the Tsar and his family were thrown out, the United States had a provisional government under Kerensky. We had a provisional government. We thought Fidel Castro would be our man when Batista was out in Cuba, and we thought Bakhtiar would be our man in Iran when the Shah was out. American foreign policy is to support suppression and repressions, and if the system cracks, have a second backup man that continues your policy. But if Kerensky leaves and Castro turns against us, and the policy in Iran went totally wild, they didn't expect Khomeini to take over power, Bakhtiar was out, then we're left fumbling and not knowing quite what to do, how to restructure, and the only way then seems to go to war. If you can't win their minds and hearts with bribes and terror and police force, then it seems that we have to get ready for war against Iran and war against Cuba and war against Russia, because our backup people were not controllable. Well, Summers wrote about the Tsar, and then he wrote a new book called Conspiracy. I don't have it yet, on the Kennedy assassination. He serviced in New York this last Monday at a party, and he was with the liberal chic, the group that gathered around and think this is very wonderful. There's a conspiracy they've discovered. Norman Mailer was at the party, and I had friends who were at the party, and they told me that the man who supervised it, who was the entrepreneur, the man who took Mr. Summers around, was none other than G. Robert Blakey, the fellow from the CIA, the Justice Department, who covered up the Kennedy assassination. Actually, criminally, he took $6 million and an oath of office and covered it all up and closed the hearings very quickly. When he had Santos Trafficanta and the mobsters on, he gave back money to Congress and said, we're ending our investigation. We don't need all this money. So that the second official investigation into the Kennedy assassination really concludes with the story of organized crime and a possible conspiracy into the murder of John Kennedy. For those of you who did not keep up with my week-to-week work on the House Select Committee and assassinations and G. Robert Blakey, you can get the tape number 370. That's January the 5th, 1979. I have a triangle there going up to a point. Actually, 10 is the top in a scale of 10. 10 seems to be the magic number, right? Okay, well, on a scale of 10, the officials investigating it now, the people who are getting the attention of the media, such as G. Robert Blakey, have gotten up to number 4, the organized crime syndicate connections, the revenge for Robert Kennedy wanting to kill Fidel Castro, or for intent to prosecute organized crime. They're up to an organized crime conspiracy. They have to get to the anti-Castro Cubans yet, who are funded by the CIA. They almost got there when the committee ended their hearings. They haven't gotten into the role of Division 5 of the FBI, or Navy Intelligence, or the Defense Industry Security Command, or Interpol, or the Nazi connections to the assassination, or the Pentagon connections and the Justice Department working with all of them. To get a perfect 10, they've got to work, but they're at 4 now. Is Summers' book Conspiracy any good? I'm sure it's worth reading. I'll read it. Books by E. Howard Hunt, William Colby, William Sullivan, J. Edgar Hoover, you name it. They don't tell the whole truth, whether it's G. Gordon Liddy or John Ehrlichman, but they tell a lot. They tell you certain times and places where they were. They tell you about the context, the people they know. It's like William Taub's book, Forces of Power. It doesn't tell you every dirty little thing that he did or he knows about, but it tells you who he worked with, how the Vatican gave him oil paintings, how the Teamsters took a painting of his from the Vatican, how he worked with the Torrio family on the one hand, and how Richard Nixon worked with the other sister on the other, how much money was taken out of the Dominican Republic. Even a bad book tells you a lot of information, and if 1/3 of it is off, 2/3 of it is real. And even if it's reversed, there's a lot of information in these books. So I will read The Conspiracy. But here is a man talking about the Romanovs in their file on the Tsar, now jumping to the Kennedy assassination, and in between are these interwoven links of the Tsarists, the Sherbatovs from Russia who helped the Tsar's family escape, arriving in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and working with Marina Oswald, their families in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There are lineal connections of George de Bornfield, whose father ran the Nobel oil fields, Baku fields in Tsarist Russia, being the close friend and confidant of Lee and Marina Oswald, their intelligence agent contact in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and at the same time a long association with Nelson Rockefeller and the Defense Department and the intelligence community. We're talking about an era where many of the people involved are dead and some of them are still alive, and they're interesting connections, and once you make those, you have solved a lot of the assassinations and conspiracies going on. But I did want to mention there was this party in New York, and that G. Robert Blakey was there escorting Anthony Summers around as he introduced his book. I mentioned a few weeks ago the information of Melvin Belli, Jack Ruby's attorney, being the attorney for Mrs. Goering, Mr. Hermann Goering's wife, the Nazi, and they had a daughter, Etta. I received some interesting pictures from one of my subscribers. Many of you have the Police Gazette. If you don't have it, I'll give you the information again next week. I hope I have time to do that. It won't fit on the page this week. There's so much information. But the Police Gazette that came out in January 1977, the issue that said Hitler is alive, has a beautiful picture of Eva Braun, and she has two children on her lap. And under the article it says, in the later years, Eva was happy to play the role of mother to Hitler's children. In the book Hitler's Secret Life, this new book that just came out by Glenn Infield, that is so interesting. There, I referred to the picture of Hitler with Eva Braun, and they referred to the daughter of Eva's friend, Herta Schneider, and it said she was often seen, this little girl with Hitler and Eva. Many persons thought the girl was their daughter. There is evidence that Hitler did have a child born December the 1st, 1931, by Goering's wife, Emmy. And then the same party who sent me a copy of the picture, Police Gazette, which I do own, sent another enclosure from a book, and it said Goering's wife, Emmy, with daughter, Etta. The photograph was inscribed to Thomas Van Kansow, Goering's stepson. But the picture of the children, the little girl that is with the mother, Emmy, and the little girl that was with Eva Braun, could be the same child, the same nose, the same face, the cheeks, the hairline, and this person has picked up this similarity that the child that Eva Braun is holding could be Hitler's daughter. One book comes out now and says that Mrs. Goering did have a child by Hitler. Another source says that Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress and woman friend, was the mother of Hitler's children. She played the role of mother to Hitler's children. Then there's a picture of Mrs. Goering with the same child, the same little girl that Eva Braun also is holding, and it looks like the same daughter. This is important because I have constantly worked the last 17 years on the Nazi connections to the assassination of John Kennedy. And Melvin Belli, the man who represented Jack Ruby complained to the Warren Commission he wouldn't let me testify at my own trial for murdering Lee Harvey Oswald because he said, Jack, that would be premeditation. And Jack Ruby wanted to tell the Warren Commission that he knew in advance that he was supposed to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. The role of the attorney is to protect your client, right or wrong. This client said, because of what I did, a whole new form of government is going to come in. I want to tell you what happened before I died. The purpose of serving history or truth was not allowed in this case or in any of these other cases. Jack Ruby wasn't allowed to tell, but the important thing is that the man that forbid him from testifying, that forbid him from telling, was Melvin Belli, who was the attorney for the Hells Angels, the mob of hoodlum Nazi goon squads that created havoc with anti-war protesters and hippies around the world. He was the attorney for Mrs. Goering, the wife of Hitler's, one of his top aides, and if Hitler has a child, he then represents Mrs. Goering and her family, which would be Hitler's child, and the Nazi connections of Goering to Belli to Jack Ruby have to be told. They're there in the Friends of the Middle East, in John Connolly, and in various elements of the intelligence community. And by silencing Jack Ruby, the conspiracy was kept down, the lid was kept. And the point is that this man, who later surfaces also a close friend of Errol Flynn and his family, and now the documentation is coming out of the role of Errol Flynn with the Gestapo and the Nazis. And next week I want to get back with you and do an update about Jonestown. I don't think I'll have time to complete it on the tape this week. Joe Holsinger, the aide to Leo Ryan, has been making public statements on the radio in San Francisco, KGO, KPFA, and also for the San Francisco Examiner, a long article. He's done some research on the Jonestown story. I gave him a lot of information and the sheets from my tapes a while back, and he's been investigating those, and he accused the CIA of being a group or organization that led U.S. Representative Leo Ryan down to be slain. He says that he was allowed to go into a death trap. He is charged that the CIA was involved with Jonestown from the very beginning, which is what I said a long time ago when Jim Jones was in Belo Horizonte in Brazil and visited the property. And, of course, there's the links of Indiana and Dan Mintrione, and those of you who don't have those tapes can get my Jonestown tapes. The important thing is that he's making these statements. He is charging that the government has covered up the Jonestown story, that the House Foreign Relations Committee has previously said there was no CIA involvement. The House International Operations Subcommittee 3 months ago heard his testimony. The House Intelligence Committee is too close to the CIA to do anything. We have 3 committees. One of them may do something we don't know. Holsinger ruled out the House Foreign Relations Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, so now it's the House International Operations Subcommittee. He claims the CIA worked closely in touch with Jim Jones. They established the government in Guyana as against Jagan. They wanted Burnham. Joe Holsinger is working with a group called the Alliance for the Preservation of Religious Liberty. This is a group based in Washington, D.C., who are separately doing investigation in Jonestown and coming to some of the same conclusions that Mr. Holsinger is looking into. He has stated publicly that Jonestown was used for mind control experiments. I believe I was the first person in the media in any form to suggest that was an experimentation station for mind control. He referred to their medical facilities and how he checked up and found that they did medical tests on everybody daily, so they must have all been in some process or form of experimentation. And he's been talking about the vast mind control experiments going on down there. He has exposed Mr. Dwyer, that was one of the men at the airport that disappeared and escaped the shooting at the airport, and how the tapes of Jim Jones have been suppressed, that the FBI has tapes where Jones is saying, "Get Dwyer out of here." And Dwyer worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. This is now confirmed, was out at the airport. He's talking publicly about George Philip Blakey, the husband of Deborah Layton Blakey, that he was a mercenary recruiter for the CIA, and he worked for forces in Angola in 1975, the Operation Anita. That Blakey, one of the men that helped set up Jonestown, was a mercenary for the intelligence community. He's still alive and floating out there somewhere. And he's also talking about Lawrence Layton, the father of the gentleman that was acquitted of some charges just a few weeks ago down in Jonestown, Larry Layton, as being a former chemical warfare specialist, U.S. Army. Now, I called his attention to that. That was in the New York Times, very establishment newspaper, talking about the role of germ warfare and biological warfare with a gentleman, Dr. Layton, whose wife supplied funds for Jim Jones and died down there of cancer, money coming from her and from Germany right down to Jonestown. I'll do more about the news coverage. I don't know if you're getting it in the East Coast at all. I'm not getting it from my newspapers from the East on the mind control and Joe Holsinger's statements, but he is pushing for some investigations, and there's reason to believe that some people are investigating on the side, just as I was doing early, and are coming to conclusions similar to what I had, and Mr. Holsinger's own investigators are coming to those conclusions. It's always a satisfaction to see these things fall into place, but my goodness, it takes a long time and a lot of work, and the people doing it have trouble doing it together. We each do it separately and come to the same conclusions, and someday I hope there's a body of people to present this evidence to the American public. Next week I'll try to update the tapes with stories of some of the latest deaths or near deaths of important witnesses and important people to study They are dying, and we should take note of the time they die and what they were doing at the time and how they fit into that famous time slot of history. Studying history means watching the dates, who lives, who dies, when they die, and how they died, and were they wiped out, to erase some of the facts that we're trying to put together.
And point me toward tomorrow.